Hey everyone, welcome back. If you're listening to this, you're probably the kind of person who likes to go deep, really understand a topic, not just skim the surface. So that's exactly what we're doing today. We're taking a deep dive, a really deep dive into narcissism.
It's one of those words that gets thrown around a lot, but to really grasp it, we need to go beyond the cliches and the stereotypes.
Exactly, and we've got a great guide for that. Dr. W. Keith Campbell's article, The New Science of Narcissism, really digs into
It's
this.
fascinating stuff. Dr. Campbell challenges us to see narcissism not as simple vanity, but as this complex trait that exists on a spectrum with both potential upsides and some pretty significant downsides.
So that spectrum idea is really key, right? And that's what we're going to unpack today, the whole spectrum. We'll pull out the most insightful stuff from Dr. Campbell's work and try to give you a much clearer picture of how it all works.
Yeah, get ready for some aha moments because we're going to go deep.
Okay, so let's dive right in. One of the first things that struck me from Dr. Campbell's work was this distinction he makes between what's called trait narcissism and something much more serious, narcissistic personality disorder, NPD.
Right. It's crucial to understand that difference because when we talk about narcissism, we're not always talking about a clinical diagnosis.
Okay, so when we say trait narcissism, we're talking about everyday narcissism, like things we might see in people around us without it being a full-blown disorder.
Exactly. Think about qualities like confidence, maybe a bit of charm, a certain social boldness. These are all traits that can actually be quite advantageous in certain contexts.
I can see that, like, if you're in a leadership role, you probably need a certain degree of self-belief, right?
Absolutely. And it's often seen in successful performers, entrepreneurs, people who really put themselves out there. That inherent self-belief can be a real driver.
But there's a flip side, right? Where those same traits can become problematic.
Oh, definitely. When trait narcissism gets out of balance, it can really mess with your relationships. And there's often a lack of self-awareness that comes with it. Someone with really high trait narcissism might struggle to see how their actions are affecting others.
And at that point, is it moving closer to NPD territory?
Yeah, potentially. NPD is a clinical diagnosis. We're talking about a persistent pattern of grandiosity, a constant need for admiration, and a real lack of empathy. And NPD can often go hand in hand with other mental health issues, making it even more complex.
So we're not just talking about someone being a bit self-absorbed. This is something much deeper, right?
Definitely. Dr. Campbell uses this narcissism spectrum model, which I think is a really useful way to visualize it. Picture a sliding scale. On one end, you have healthy self-confidence. As you move along the scale, you see more and more pronounced narcissistic traits.
And at the far end of the spectrum, we have NPD, that pathological level of narcissism. Okay, that visual really helps. Now, I know Dr. Campbell also talks about different faces of narcissism. It's not just one type of person we're talking about.
Right, and this was a big aha moment for me. He talks about two main subtypes,
Yeah.
grandiose narcissism and vulnerable narcissism. And what's so interesting is that while both come from this core of self-centeredness, they can look completely different on the surface.
So let's start with grandiose narcissism. What does that look like?
Okay, this is probably what most people picture when they think of a narcissist. These are the folks who are outgoing, assertive, always promoting themselves.
The classic image, right?
Yeah. They often gravitate towards fields where they can be in the spotlight, like politics or entertainment. They need that attention, that admiration, to feel good about themselves. And they can be incredibly charismatic, especially at first.
Right, the life of the party, super confident, maybe even flamboyant. But you mentioned something earlier about fragility.
Yeah, and this is crucial. Even with all that outward confidence, there's often this deep-seated insecurity underneath. They're building their identity on external validation, which means it's always at risk. We'll come back to that later, but it's a really key piece of the puzzle.
Okay, so we've got the grandiose type. Now, what about vulnerable narcissism? Because vulnerable isn't a word you typically associate with narcissism.
Exactly. And it's often overlooked, but it's just as important to understand. These folks tend to be more anxious, more introverted, very sensitive to their emotions. They often feel overlooked, underappreciated, and they can get really hung up on how others see them.
So it's almost like they're hyper aware of how they're being perceived, and it really affects them.
Totally.
Yeah.
And it often comes from low self-esteem, ironically. They're trying to protect themselves from feeling inadequate. They still have that self-centeredness, but it comes out in a different way. It's more reactive, more internalized.
So the grandiose type is actively seeking attention, while the vulnerable type is more focused on not getting the attention they think they deserve.
Precisely. And they can be easily hurt, take things personally that weren't meant that way. But despite these seeming opposites, Dr. Campbell says there's a core that links both types.
That's fascinating. So what is that shared core? What's the thread that connects these two very different presentations?
It comes down to self-centeredness and a fragile sense of self. Both types are preoccupied with themselves, but they go about it in different ways. One is constantly seeking validation, while the other is constantly worrying about not getting enough.
And that makes me think about the role our society might play in all of this. Dr. Campbell talks about how our culture might be amplifying these traits, doesn't he?
He does, and it's really thought-provoking. He argues that some of the shifts we've seen in society, especially in Western cultures, have actually made narcissistic traits more common.
Like what kinds of shifts?
Well, social media is a big one. Think about it. These platforms are designed for self-promotion, for curating a perfect image, for constantly seeking likes and followers.
It's like everyone's become their own PR agent, right?
Yeah, exactly. And then there's this broader emphasis on individualism. It's all about me, my achievements, my happiness. That focus can unintentionally fuel these tendencies.
And what about how we raise our kids? I know there's been a lot of talk about the self-esteem movement and whether that's gone too far.
Yeah, Dr. Campbell touches on that too. He says that if we overemphasize a child's uniqueness, if we constantly inflate their self-esteem without any real basis, it can actually backfire. It can create this sense of entitlement, a lack of grounding in reality.
So it's about finding that balance between fostering confidence and teaching kids to be humble and empathetic.
Exactly. And I love this analogy Dr. Campbell uses. He says that social media has put a microphone in front of everyone's mirror. We're not just reflecting on ourselves privately anymore. We're broadcasting it to the world.
That's such a powerful image, and it really highlights how much the environment has shifted. Now let's go back to that idea of the fragile ego. How does that connect to this constant need for external validation?
Well, for someone with narcissistic traits, their sense of self-worth isn't coming from within. It's dependent on what other people think, on their achievements, their appearance, their social status.
So their sense of value is constantly fluctuating based on external factors.
Yeah, it's very precarious. If those sources of validation dry up, their whole sense of self can crumble. And that's where ego armor comes in.
Okay, ego armor, what's that?
Think of it as a defense mechanism. That grandiosity, the self-promotion, even the defensiveness, these are all ways of protecting that fragile inner self. It's like they're projecting an image of strength to hide the insecurity they feel underneath.
So that confident exterior is actually a mask?
Often, yes. And that's what makes it so tricky. They're really good at performing, at presenting the image they think will get them the validation they need. But underneath, they're struggling. And as you can imagine, this really affects their relationships.
Because relationships require empathy,
Right.
a willingness to see things from the other person's perspective.
Exactly. And that's a real challenge for someone whose primary focus is on their own needs and their own validation. Relationships become more about what the other person can do for them and less about genuine connection.
And you mentioned earlier that the two types of narcissism might play out differently in relationships.
They do. Someone with vulnerable narcissism might be very clingy, constantly seeking reassurance, fearing rejection. And someone with grandiose narcissism might be more controlling, more manipulative, always needing to be the center of attention.
So in both cases, it's really hard to build healthy, balanced relationships.
It is. And Dr. Campbell makes this really important point. Narcissism isn't about self-love. It's about self-obsession. It's driven by this need to feel worthy, admired, powerful, but it's always coming from a place of lack. Now, the question a lot of people have is, can it change?
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Can these patterns be altered?
Well, it's definitely not easy. These are often deeply ingrained patterns, but Dr. Campbell does talk about the possibility of change. It takes a lot of work, a lot of self-awareness.
So what kind of approaches might be helpful?
Therapy is a big one. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, can help people identify and challenge those negative thought patterns. And psychodynamic therapy can help them understand the underlying causes of their behavior.
And are there things people can do outside of therapy?
Yeah, self-awareness practices like mindfulness and journaling can be really helpful.
Yeah.
And getting honest feedback from people you trust, though it can be tough to hear, can also be a catalyst for change.
It sounds like it takes a lot of honesty with yourself, a willingness to really look at your own behavior.
It does. And Dr. Campbell talks about cultural remedies as well, promoting things like community values, humility, service to others, shifting the focus away from the individual and towards the collective.
So it's about a change in mindset, both individually and societally.
Yeah, exactly. And he really emphasizes the importance of empathy education. Teaching kids from a young age to understand and care about the feelings of others, that's crucial.
It sounds like addressing this issue requires effort on so many levels.
It does. But I think the first step is understanding it, recognizing it in ourselves and in the world around us. So as we wrap up, let's just recap some of those key takeaways.
Okay, so narcissism isn't just one thing, it's a spectrum. And it can manifest in ways that are both functional and dysfunctional.
And our culture, with its focus on individual achievement and self-promotion, is definitely playing a role in amplifying these tendencies.
But there's hope, right? We can learn to be more self-aware, more humble, more connected to others.
Absolutely. And those are the things that will ultimately create a healthier, more balanced sense of self, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
So as you go about your day, think about this. How might our culture be subtly nudging us along that narcissism spectrum? And what small changes can we make in our own lives and in our interactions with others to counteract that?
It's something worth reflecting on, because the more we understand about narcissism, the better equipped we are to navigate it in a way that promotes healthy relationships and a more compassionate world.
Well said. And thank you all for joining us on this deep dive into the new science of narcissism. If you want to go even deeper, you can find Dr. Campbell's full presentation on YouTube. We've included a link in the show notes. Until next time, keep exploring.